Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery. Well, my wormery is really my basement, and the bins behind me have worms in them, so I call this my wormery. In my worm bins, I compost kitchen scraps and household waste, and I do my best to try to divert stuff from ending up in the landfill, just going into the trash unnecessarily. If it's stuff that the worms can break down, then by all means, I'm putting aside and I'm doing my best to feed it to the worms rather than making trash out of it. And in the end, that process is rewarding me with a whole bunch of really nice worm compost at the end. So I think it's worth the effort, not to mention just the feeling of, doing a responsible thing with your compostable household waste. So I've got a few of those bins back there on my radar for today. I'm not sure how many of them I'm going to tend to, so I sort of jotted down information about the three oldest ones. The three oldest ones are the ones on the top shelf. As you work your way down, you get to the newer and newer systems. You can see I've got a little infiltration of water coming in from outside. So the newest stuff has been moved away so that puddle can, hopefully evaporate. It's going to rain all day today, so that puddle's probably going to get bigger before it gets any smaller. So I'm just keeping an eye on it. But luckily, that's just because I've not cleaned out my gutters. It's not common for water to come in. It's just we're in the middle of autumn. My gutters are full of leaves, and they're not working the way they're supposed to as far as diverting all the rainwater that's been coming down all night and what's going to come down all day today. So whatever, we'll deal with it. But the system that I'm most interested in checking in on is one we looked in on a week ago. It's the bin that I've got mixed worms in. It's sort of a variety of worms living in that bin. And it was a week ago that we last checked in on it to see how its foraging was coming along. At that point, it had been foraging for 4 weeks, meaning no fresh food's been added for 4 weeks, giving the worms a chance to really focus their energy on breaking down all the residual scraps of leftover food and bedding in there. And today, after another week, we're now 5 weeks into the foraging process. A lot of times that's where I decide to call it quits with that, and I switch to the migration of the worms out of the material. But I've got a couple of stats here I wanted to just talk about. The oldest bin that we're talking about here is the mixed tray of worms. Before I got into the so-called foraging phase, that system had been doing everyday composting for 132 days. And over that time I had given it 15 feedings before deciding 5 weeks ago to just stop. And over these past 5 weeks, I'm questioning whether it's time to put an end to foraging and start migration. But now I've got a couple other systems over here too. Right next to that box on the top shelf, I've got my European nightcrawler systems as well. All of these systems also might be at that stage where they might be ready to transition. This system here is also foraging. I mean, it's only been foraging for not even 3 weeks now, so this one might not be ready to be switched over to migration yet. But this system here has telltale signs of possibly needing to be switched over to foraging, because a lot of times it's the 15th feeding that I treat as the last feeding, and just the age of it is also fairly mature relative to when I usually switch bins from composting to foraging. So I believe I've got a couple decisions to make. I'm not sure about getting to the night crawlers. I'm a little limited on time, so I might actually just check in on the foraging status of my mixed bin to see if it's possibly time to start switching these guys over to migration, which is really just an attempt to lure the worms out of their finished compost so that they could be relocated into a new home. So I'm going to put on a glove and we're going to get this mixed bin up on the bench, see how it's coming along, and make a decision on what to do with it next. So let's get to work. Okay, I'm all set to go. So now these things over here, these are the things that had been covering up the top surface of the material that's in this bin up until a couple weeks ago. So I took off these paper coverings that were resting on the top of the contents of the bin, and I swapped them out for a piece of plastic to try to boost up the bin's ability to hang on to its own moisture. And I think just by doing so, it also stimulates recirculation of the existing moisture, and also on top of that does so in a much more thorough way so that stuff in the middle is nice and damp as you would expect it to be, but even the stuff that's right out on the very edges is pretty damp too, because it's all protected from the drying effects of evaporation with this sheet of plastic I rested on the top surface. So let's just evict these little wormies hanging to the plastic before we set the plastic aside. I guess just in case there's any more of them stuck on here, we'll just fold the whole thing in half. This way the dampness of the material that's stuck to it can keep them from freaking out and getting overly dry. So these worms in here are sort of a variety of different worms living together. So when it was given to me, it was described as being the so-called Uncle Jim's mix, which is just sort of a red worm mix as it's referred to. And I think it consists of sort of a medium-sized worm, and I think this might be one of them, which is a red wiggler, a somewhat smaller sized worm, which is right here, I believe, an example of, or maybe this one here, the Indian blue worms. And there's also supposedly European night crawlers mixed into here as well. And once in a while I do admittedly bump into a fat worm in this system, but it seems like that used to happen more frequently in the past. More recently, I don't recall that happening. I don't recall bumping into many Euros in here. So I'm just starting to wonder if they have been kind of nudged out because they're just because of their small numbers, you know, maybe there just wasn't enough breeding opportunities. I think at some point, if nature took its course, this would probably just end up being a bin of nothing but blue worms. But really, if we left this to go much further, it would be pure castings, I bet. It was, I don't know. I'm not sure how long it would take, because a lot of this stuff does look like it could take a little bit of time still. Little chunks of maybe leaf or paper or whatever. I have been, in the past few weeks or past few check-ins, collecting all this stuff out on the surface, which appears to be like larger chunk material. Sometimes it's a little drier because I wasn't always covering with plastic. And then I would create a crevice down the middle to place all that material down low so that it would have constant exposure to the moisture of the surrounding castings. Keep it all hydrated and keep it all fair game for breakdown by the worms. So I'm sure down here in this middle section we'll probably bump into a few scraps of me doing that. And besides just, you know, dry stuff like that, I also took whatever I could find as far as leftovers from past feedings and put them all down in there too. So now you can start seeing a little bit of what I'm talking about. It's this stuff right here. I think I'm just going to be consistent with what I have been doing in the past, which is to collect this stuff up as I encounter it. But the one way we might be able to deviate from what we've done in the past is to not just put it back down in the middle for continued breakdown, but maybe we use it as the stuff on which to base our horizontal migration feeding zone. Because if we were to decide today that it's time for this system to switch from foraging to migration, my method of migrating the worms out of the material is typically to try to lure them to one edge of the bin. I've seen other approaches where people try to bait them down to the middle. I've even seen a few examples, people trying to leave the finished compost in the middle and lure the worms out to the outer edges in two directions. I can certainly see the envisioned advantages of various approaches. So I think people just eventually gravitate to whatever system suits their liking or their needs, whatever the case may be. But this stuff is so nice and the moisture level is just right and it just crumbles in your fingers, and you know, there is so much leftover stuff in here, little stems and little this, little that. But I always battle at this point, at this decision-making point, in terms of what to do next. Because it does always seem like, you know, hey, all this stuff right here, isn't that right there the answer? That you just need more time for all that to break down too? And I guess that is true if you're striving for 100%. A lot of times that's striving for 100% is what I think ends up becoming more of just sort of a hang-up rather than something that's worthwhile pursuing. Just sort of this imaginary state of this being completely broken down 100% into castings and not having to worry about little scraps of stuff like this. In my book, this stuff is pretty much finished castings. If there's little residual scraps of compostable matter remaining in it, to me it just seems like stuff to sustain the life within the material into the near future, at least for a little while, so that they're just going to keep thriving in here. Even though there's no more worm action, all the microscopic life in the system still has plenty to work on. And I bet you just over time, just from that too, it would break down really nicely. So I think we've pretty much located all the large chunk materials that we've been gradually collecting in the middle of the bin here over a few weeks' time. And if you look at it, it certainly doesn't amount to much either, because every time, I think I've even noted it a few times, every time I would go ahead and return it back down into the bin, sprinkling it down into the hole that I made for it, I would always start to notice more and more each time how the amount of it was just so minimal, making me question whether it was worth, extending the process just for the sake of that material to be able to break down, especially if this stuff would actually come in as a really good material to build up our feeding zone out of, which I think it would be. Because I've got some really nice bedding that I've created in advance, sort of just aging on the shelf and becoming more and more scrumptious for the worms to want to nibble away at, versus just taking, dry bedding that you just shredded or whatever and giving it to the worms. This stuff's been dampened and sort of inoculated with some material to help the life in it kick up. So we'll use some of my special blend of pre-made bedding, but then we'll also use this stuff over here, and I think it'll create a spot in the bin that the worms will definitely want to go hang out at. Thinking over time, we'll probably be checking in the future and giving ourselves other opportunities to really pour through the material to see if we can further collect additional stuff like this, large chunk materials that are probably best off in the feeding area or migration area. Sometimes I don't know what to refer to it as, because it does seem like it's just stuff that's going to eventually go with the worms when they get migrated. It's not contributing to the overall collection of compost that this session yielded. So sometimes I wonder if the feedings that I apply for migrations should be tracked differently and don't really chalk up to the overall number of feedings that the system got to produce the amount of castings that I ended up with. I don't know, these are just the little weird things that I think about sometimes when I look at the data that I track about my systems to see if it's potentially flawed or, maybe not telling as clear a story as it could. Alright, now you can kind of see why I don't go to the very tippy top of my bins, max out the capacity of these bins, because when you start doing a little special project like setting up the system for migrating the worms or whatever the case may be in your situation, sometimes you just need that extra space to be able to pile the stuff up over here, so you got a little bit of room to work over here. So I like treating kind of the halfway point of the bin also as the limit, so that I don't kind of work my way into a corner and can't do the work that I want to do in the bin because I've used it all up. So I sometimes put up a little bit of a partition wall when I set up a migration zone like this, just so later it's easier for me to see, hey, where was that finished castings and where is the new migration zone, and also help prevent the material from getting commingled. Obviously that could also serve as a barricade preventing the worms from getting through it, but that's the reason I usually punch it full of holes. So I don't have one ready, so I'm going to take a little pause right now and go fashion one for this job, one we could slip right in here. And then I'll also need to go up to the refrigerator to get some food that we could use to set this edge of the bin up with all kinds of, like I said, fresh bedding that I've got, some nice used bedding, some fresh food from upstairs. as well as a nice plastic covering going back over on top of it to keep whatever moisture's in it circulating nicely. And then we'll also set it up in such a way that the remainder of the material has an ongoing opportunity to keep drying, further providing motivation for the worms to exit the material. So it's break time now. I'll be right back when I've got the food we need to set up the feeding zone, and once I've got the partition wall that we're going to use to put in here. So this work of art is going to become our barrier, and I cut it for the most part, leaving only enough to barely hold it, so I could just snap it like that. So this stuff will go right into here, and I've got a couple tubes here, a couple of these cardboard tubes that appear to be just about the right size to work as sort of a spacer to hold up the cardboard boards until such a time that we build up the feeding area. But we could also support it on this side by stacking up the material right up to the tippy top. You know, maybe even giving the worms a chance to just crawl right over the top if they'd prefer to go that way. Maximizing the exposure to the baiting area, or the migration area, whatever you want to refer to it as. And then we'll level off the rest, but we first have to utilize all this stuff that we've collected over here in the corner. We'll tap into my supply of pre-made bedding that I talked about earlier. And you can see it here. It's just shredded newspaper and cardboard bits combined with leaves and moisture, as well as a little inoculant, as I like to refer to it as, which is just a little bit of material out of a worm bin, a little bit of vermicompost, which brings with it all of the microscopic life that you really want to have in your bedding material. Some people, I think, even put food for that microscopic life into their pre-made bedding mixes, stuff like molasses or whatever. I suppose that would be an option too. I actually thought about maybe using coffee for that purpose. Just sprinkling some coffee in there, a little nitrogen source of food, so that the life in there can thrive and grow. So from the kitchen I bought the typical portion of coffee to put in here, and I just grabbed whatever I could from the freezer that seemed like it would kind of hold together as its own little bunch without falling apart. And I think it's already starting to show signs of falling apart. I can also see that there's a piece of plastic that it's in, so let's start emptying this plastic bag out, chipping away at some of these little chunks of asparagus and whatever else might be in here. Oh, this is actually a separate it's usually oops. It's usually the stuff is in the bag, not stuck to the bag, like you see here. So, whatever. There's a little bit more stuff in there, but it's not quite as much as I thought it would be. So let's drop in a little bit of coffee to go with that, but maybe not all of it. We'll put this stuff in layers. We'll add a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and hopefully what we end up here is something that the worm's going to be pretty much unable to resist, because it's going to have food and fresh bedding and grit, which is what I just put in there a moment ago. That's the grit that I use, which is pulverized eggshell. This stuff here is also going to add to the appeal of what we put together for them over here. This is just a whole bunch of stuff that's also pretty rich in microscopic life to help all this fresh food that we're giving them start breaking down, make it really easy for them to take advantage of as a food source once they get over here. So what do we got left? We'll drop in the remainder of this coffee. I think just for kicks we'll put in this coffee filter right on top of the feeding. Cover it up a little bit. But I got a feeling there's not going to be a whole lot of that piece of paper left once we come back in here next time. It's right there in between a couple layers of yummy food and whatnot that we're giving these guys. This sort of smells like parsley. A lot of the stuff I feed my worms is contributed from my mom's kitchen. So very often I'm getting little care packages intended for the worms. Little cuttings of this and that. So sometimes I can sort of recognize it, sometimes I can't. So this stuff could possibly have been contributed by my mom, but I'm never totally sure. So I think the only other thing we're going to put in here is just a touch more of my homemade bedding mix here. Sprinkle it over the top of the food. And give them a really, really nice space that they would all want to come over to and stay in once they come over. So officially, we are now no longer foraging in my mixed bin. We are officially in migration mode. So I'll be curious to see how long it takes for the worms to exit this material. There's so many variables, you know. I mean, it could be how dry the material is, for example. Maybe the material has gotten so dry already that the worms are just itching for a better place to be, a place where there's a nice supply of moisture and whatnot. So sometimes maybe the food supply has been depleted for so long that just, you know, the scent of some food nearby on the other end of the bin is going to be enough to get them all running over to come get a piece of it. So I'm never quite sure really where I am with regards to all those variables. I try to get it to some point where it seems like I could, you know, look someone in the eye and feel confident about what I'm saying in terms of the maturity level of the material. You know, I mean, you got to admit there is a whole bunch of stuff mixed into this alongside the castings, but, you know, in large part it is castings, you know. And whatever, at some point in the future I'll be also, once I've moved all the worms out of this stuff, I'll probably be running this as sort of a cocoon nursery. So that's part of the other reason I don't mind leaving a little bit of material behind within the castings. Material, you know, like little scraps of bedding and food. Because at some point in the future, even though all the adult worms have been moved out into a new place to continue their work, I'll set up this material as a place in which I expect all the cocoons in the material to eventually result in new baby worms, almost like a new population springing out of nowhere. And that's probably going to be the next phase of this bin. Although technically I kind of treat that as like a done deal already. That bin is history. As far as I'm concerned, those are finished castings. Do with them what you will. So a lot of times it would just be used right out in the garden, at least in the past. But more recently I've been running my finished castings through that final stage of making sure that any cocoons that are left behind by the adult worms have time to hatch, babies can be rounded up. Then it starts to seem to me like a batch of truly finished worm compost. All right, everyone. Well, there's not much left for me to do here. I would like to cover up here a little bit better. So this is probably a good opportunity to revive some of these old pieces of paper that we had covered with once upon a time. I mean, some of it could probably be left out here to help cover this material. But then again, we're not going to cover up with a whole lot more because the aim is going to be to let this stuff over here dry while we maintain moisture on only this end of the bin, which is where we'll cover up with plastic and try to prompt the nice terrarium effect. Preserving all the moisture content that's on this end of the bin, preventing it from escaping out and evaporating away. So now the other thing we would do at this stage is cover up, but we're not covering up the entirety of the bin anymore like we were before. We're going to be covering up only the space where the feedings are going to be happening and where the worms are being encouraged to congregate and move over to, which is this end of the bin. So this is the only end of the bin that I'll keep covered with plastic to keep it nice and damp and cozy while the rest of the bin is left to gradually get a little bit more dry. Luckily it's worm castings, so worm castings just by their nature have the ability to hang on to moisture remarkably on their own, but allowing a little bit of airflow in the areas that are only covered with paper or cardboard allows for a little bit of drying, which I think will help motivate the worms to seek out the end of the bin over here where the moisture's circulating, where the fresh food's just been added, and all that other fun stuff. So, all right, everyone, that's it. We're now migrating my mixed worm bin, and we'll see how long it takes. But that's pretty much the end of the video. I got a couple things to clean up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated, and if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching.